Welcome to Professor Sky's Spam channel. So I just finished rewatching The Sopranos, and I wanted to share some of my thoughts. Overall, I would say I was afraid. I was afraid to rewatch it. I haven't watched it for over a decade, and in the interim, I've watched all these other shows that it birthed, okay? All these other anti-heroes who are at the edge of society, who you root for and you root against. I've watched them all for good and bad, and I was afraid that the impact, the narrative impact of The Sopranos would be so undercut by all the imitators that I would be left unmoved, and that initial sense of like shock and awe that I initially had would have been gone. So before I get into more details, I will tell you this is my overall takeaway from rewatching The Sopranos. The good parts were better than I remembered, but there were a lot more bad parts than I remembered as well. So my initial memory was there was nothing bad about it at all, perfect show in every way, but as I started to rewatch it, I realized my estimation was a bit too high. Before I go further, you might think that the reason I'm doing this is because I did that video on the Many Saints of Newark, but it's not. It's actually thanks to this book. Now, I'm not being paid by Nick Braccia. He's a friend of mine on Facebook, and I've had a conversation with him, and I like supporting his work. He also does a lot of good stuff with a horror podcast called Video Palace. I suggest watching. And he made this book. And this book, I don't know, I guess I'm plugging it because I like my friends to succeed. You know, he's not cutting me any money. But it's a funny and interesting book because what it does is I think what most books about TV shows should do. You don't read it in one set thing. It's broken into little tiny bite-sized chunks. And what I realized was that this book, for lack of a better word, is sort of a YouTube channel. It's sort of a bunch of little tiny videos, little tiny chunks of information. My favorite one is about David Chase before The Sopranos. I'm a big fan of the Rockford Files. That's actually my ringtone. So, you know, it's very interesting to see a take on what was David Chase before The Sopranos. Kind of superficial thing about like all the different people who got whacked on the show. It's one of those things where you look at it and you go, oh, that's cheap, that's easy content, and then it's the first thing you read. It's the first thing I read. So it's kind of necessary. But then another thing this does so well is it goes into like the music of the show, the movies that Tony watches, the food, and does a sort of full cultural panorama of the show. And if there's one thing I can say about the show is it really merits that. It's very conscious in the music that it chooses, even the food and the movies, and to have something like this is a great guide and a great reminder of the depth of the show. A depth which I don't think any of the following, any of the next wave of the TV Renaissance ever got quite as deep as The Sopranos did in that way. So let me go through some of my takes, which I didn't find in here. Although this is one of those books where you don't know if you've read the whole thing because you kind of jump in and out of it, you know? So, I don't know, Amazon? I don't even know if it's on Amazon. I'll put a link to it. If you have a Sopranos fan in your family, I would get this. Quick tangent. The actors who play Bobby Bacala and Christopher Moltisanti have a podcast, and it's unlistenable. It's so bad. They're so boring. They have no charisma whatsoever. So, anyways, if there's one thing you're going to do, I know they're the actors and they're the people we should listen to, but it's a really good example of why you just shouldn't. Just go with the experts, not with the people who are there. So, my main takeaway is I love capicola. And I thanks to this show, I started eating capicola 20 years ago. I order it whenever I can. It's a great sub. So thank you very much. Okay, I guess I'll talk more. The biggest question I have, and this is maybe a hot take that we can debate, but who is the best actor on The Sopranos? This was the thing I didn't expect. I remember the acting as being fine, but I don't think that I was properly tuned to the acting. It's a show that's filled with so much violence and scope that you don't think about the acting. And maybe it's one of the things that Coppola did so well, the first two Godfathers, is getting actors like De Niro and Pacino to be so still and so good, without it, like the reason that Al Pacino is a great actor isn't because they pull me back in. It's the way he mumbles, "That's my family, not me," right? So like there's a fineness to the performance that you see in The Godfathers, and there's a fineness that you see in this performance. And I think initially people would say it has to be Gandolfini as the best actor because he's just a master. But I think the show can be seen almost as a competition between Falco and Gandolfini. While I was watching, I just had fun trying to think like, okay, now Gandolfini's in the lead. Okay, now Falco's in the lead. And it's not in what they say or the way they speak. That's the thing. I mean, I guess, Gandolfini has that amazing range where he gets the sort of high nasally and then the kind of growl. But it's in their wordlessness. It's in their wordless jests. It's in Gandolfini's exhalations through his nose. And it's in these faces that Edie Falco makes. The desperation, the sadness, the guilt. Like, I don't know if there's ever been better acting on television than Edie Falco on The Sopranos. That's a great role. So she has that going for her, right? I mean, maybe maybe does a lot of the work. But that was the thing that was the best thing in rediscovering it, was just every episode just being blown away by her performance, blown away by Gandolfini, especially in the moments of silence. And I don't mean the silence of looking up at the trees and watching the wind go. Like, that's fine, but that's easy. I'm talking about like moments of like silence, like at a dinner table where AJ will say something and he'll just register these looks. And so much of what makes her acting so great, I think you couldn't even put into this book because you can't really properly define it. The emotions that they're capable of expressing are not like happy and sad. It's more like begrudging contentment and contempt. It's these weird emotions which go much deeper and which are communicated by both of them. So that was the best thing that I discovered. The worst thing I discovered is Melfi is a bad character and the psychology bit is bad. Is bad. I'm not saying it was bad. But they might as well have been doing electroshock therapy for that entire thing. The psychology has moved on so far beyond. And even when it was made, it was kind of backwards. Now, in this book, there's a great interview with Jonathan Hastings, who does probably my favorite YouTube channel about movies. I don't know if he's uploaded in a while. I'll include a link to that as well. They're friends. And he sort of makes a pretty good defense of Melfi's character and her decision to do psychodynamics. But it's the thing, right? Like real psychological work, real therapy, probably doesn't translate that well to TV or to movies. And I think that was the problem. So having Melfi be so entwined, having her be so weak, having her be so disrespectful of her duty as a therapist, she was just breaking like the ways that she allowed boundaries to be broken and that she broke boundaries herself. I mean, my poor wife, she's trained in psychology. She would just like scream at the TV half the time. And again, it is partly that therapy has changed, but that's also that she's just not a very good actor. I don't know. I mean, I guess she was the only person who was famous before the show, so maybe she helped the show get made, but she seems disinterested most of the time. She has like a weird look on her face. The stuff that she does with Peter Bogdanovich, that's good. I think that's good. And I think her final scenes where she finally dismisses Tony as a client is great, but it's just so little, so late. And to me, the entire therapy idea, it cheapens the show, I think. Because I'm not sure it was needed to have you empathize with Tony or to really feel what he's going through. I think Gandolfini and the writers communicated it well enough without having him sit down and have to say, I'm really hurt by my mother. Like that's the best Gandolfini impersonation on YouTube. But I also understand that was a hook that got people into the show. That was the hook that got me into the show. When I watched it for the first time, I said, this is the greatest thing ever. It's like Analyze This, but not terribly unfunny. Another positive thing that I took from the show is AJ. And I think AJ is the character best served by Many Saints of Newark. It's a question whether or not he has an arc. I think he does. I think he's the only character with an arc. I do see growth at the end, even if it's undercut with his BMW. I do have hope for him, but the depiction of Tony Soprano Sr. as a teenager in Many Saints of Newark, put up next to the depiction of AJ, the same like sweetness that's beaten out of Tony but not beaten out of AJ, but he's conflicted and he feels like he's not enough of a man. He's constantly feeling like he's not enough of a man, and yet he never quite jumps in. The way he's able to communicate when people respect him or like him just because he's Tony Soprano's son, the look of disappointment, again another great, he's a great actor, a great wordless actor, because the confusion or the shame that he feels when people recognize him for being the son of who he's the son of, it's just it's a great job. And I understand that people, I guess, don't like him as a character, but I feel like he's sort of the most important character. I think if we take The Many Saints of Newark as an equal participant in the Sopranos verse, which I don't blame you if you don't, because a lot of people don't like that movie, and I understand why. But if you do, his breaking of the cycle, his not becoming, like Jackie April's kid, like not doing that, not making this easy move towards a simple, violent masculinity, is in and of itself a kind of heroic break. He is breaking the cycle. He and Meadow are both breaking the cycle of violence that we've seen perpetuated going all the way back to Avellino. So, I don't know. AJ was great. Made me happy. Meadow was a little bit more of a boring character than I remember. I don't necessarily dislike. Now, the main thing I'd have to say, too, my most controversial take, and this came about through watching Many Saints of Newark as well. Tony, and Paulie, and Silvio are bad characters, and they don't fit in the TV show. Now, this is complex, because much like I think the section here on whacking is beneath the quality of this book, it's also the first thing that you read when you get this book. You need Paulie and you need Silvio to sell the show, to be a moment of lightness, to have these funny characters. I mean, I actually started pointing like this until my wife stopped because she said I had enough affectations. I guess I do. But it's a cool way to point. And I would say Paulie has more of a saving grace because you have a better picture of what his family life is like, or his lack of family life. His weird, desperate desire to be connected to Tony is nice. But their outlandishness, the way they act, the rest of the mobsters are all so boring. They're all so samey. They're all just the same kind of, as my father once said when he started watching The Sopranos and stopped, I said, "Why'd you stop watching, Pa?" And he said, "It's just too many fat men swearing." To a certain extent, that is the reality, I think, of organized crime. And that was the reality that they're going for. So there was this realism in the show. And when you have the other henchmen, there's just these boring people that seem interchangeable. You don't know which guy is which. And then you have these two special henchmen with the names and the famous things, and then having them be in Many Saints of Newark acting the same way 30 years before. I'm conflicted. I think they're bad characters that need to be there, but it shows the sort of underlying problem. Going back to The Godfather, Luca Brasi is not a great character. Now, you just hit the unlike button. That's okay. He's great character because he's in the movie for the beginning, and then when he gets whacked, right? He's not a great character. Like, if he had been around always, and there's this whole thing about like Luca, like it was the menace of Luca Brasi that made him so great. It was the specter of Luca Brasi. But if he'd actually stuck around for all the movies, we don't need that kind of like, oh, he's the wacky dumb one. Just the reality, the realism of the story is broken with these caricatures, and that's what they are. Another thing I didn't realize in the first time watching, and this changed because of a lot of these people weren't stars, but the cameos. A TV show that on back-to-back episodes has Tony Hale and Burgess Meredith. I would like to put that forth as the best back-to-back cameos in the history of television. Buster Bluth and the Penguin, you know, like back-to-back. Oh, amazing. Will Arnett also makes an appearance. Lin-Manuel Miranda makes an appearance. I stopped keeping track. I did find my favorite malapropism of the show, keep your eye on the tiger. That is just beautiful. I started using that in my real life. One thing I'd like to talk about is I started watching YouTube videos about The Sopranos. And I watched one recently about everyone's least favorite episode. And it was funny because the episode, I only wanted to talk about one episode for this video, and that was Camelot. And it turns out it is the least favorite episode of most Sopranos fans. But their reason is they don't like the characters. They don't like the Tony's dad's Gumar being on the show, and they don't like the way people act and the implied love affair. Narratively, I have no problem with Camelot, but Camelot highlights something. The directing, the atmosphere, the directorial approach for The Sopranos, up until then, was so consistent that Camelot, when it was being filmed, I didn't look up who directed it before watching it. I was like, what the hell is going on here? We're having a funeral scene with someone else talking over it with dialogue somewhere else. Get that cinematic garbage out of here. All this weird editing and like zoom around cameras and all these extraneous camera work, they just made me angry. It turns out it was directed by Steve Buscemi, which makes sense. A couple other episodes felt that way as well, like one scene, like a slow motion scene with Lover, which is totally out. Towards the end of the season, they started doing these things of throwing in throwaway scenes that didn't connect to anything, that felt like red herrings. One episode, towards the end, there was like a shaky cam. I'm only bringing these things up. I don't think it actually is bad. I think it just shows how much they master the craft of making The Sopranos. That if someone does something as simple as having a voiceover over a different scene, you just get completely de-Sopranoed. That whatever directorial constraints Chase put on it, they were so effective. So there's me talking about Sopranos for 17 minutes. Those are some of my thoughts. Who's your vote? Gandolfini or Falco for the best actor in The Sopranos? I'm going Falco. Definitely get this book if you like The Sopranos, because, you know, it's a good book. All right, until next time, there's the camera. There's the camera.